Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter number 71, The Fight Against Authoritarianism, June 30th, 1932. I am afraid you will find my accounts of religious conflict in Europe rather dull. But they are important as they show us how modern Europe developed. They help us to understand Europe. The fight for religious freedom, which we see developing in Europe in the 14th century and after, and the fight for political freedom, which will come next, are really two aspects of the same struggle. This is the struggle against authority and authoritarianism. Both the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy represented absolute authority, and they tried to crush the spirit of man. The emperor was there by divine right, even more so the pope, and no one had the right to question this or disobey the orders issued to him from above. Obedience was the great virtue. Even the exercise of private judgment was considered sinful. Thus, the issue between blind obedience and freedom was quite clear. A great fight was waged in Europe for many centuries for freedom of conscience and, later, political freedom. After many ups and downs and great suffering, a measure of success was obtained. But just when people were congratulating themselves that the goal of freedom had been reached, they found that they were mistaken. There could be no real freedom without economic freedom, and so long as poverty remained. To call a starving man free is but to mock him. So the next step was the fight for economic freedom, and that fight is being waged today all over the world. Only in one country can it be said that economic freedom has been won by the people generally, and that is Russia, or rather, the Soviet Union. In India, there was no such fight for freedom of conscience, because from the earliest days, this right never seems to have been denied. People could believe in almost anything they liked, and there was no compulsion. The method of influencing the minds of people was by argument and debate, and not by the club and the stake. There may, of course, have been compulsion or violence used occasionally, but the right of freedom of conscience was admitted in the old Aryan theory. The result of this was not wholly good, strange as this may seem. Being assured of a theoretical freedom, people were not vigilant enough about it, and gradually they got more and more entangled in the rites and ceremonials and superstitions of a degraded religion. They developed a religious ideology which took them back a long way and made them slaves to religious authority. That authority was not that of a pope or other individual. It was the authority of the sacred books and customs and conventions. So while we talked of freedom of conscience and were proud to have it, we were really far from it, and were chained up by the ideas which had been impressed upon us by the old books and our customs. Authority and authoritarianism reigned over us and controlled our minds. The chains which sometimes tie up our bodies are bad enough, but the invisible chains consisting of ideas and prejudices which tie up our minds are far worse. They are of our own making, and though often we are not conscious of them, they hold us in their terrible grip. The coming of the Muslims to India as invaders introduced an element of compulsion in religion. The fight was really a political one between conqueror and conquered. But it was colored by the religious element, and there was, at times, religious persecution. But it would be wrong to imagine that Islam stood for such persecution. There is an interesting report of a speech delivered by a Spanish Muslim when he was driven out of Spain, together with the remaining Arabs, in 1610. He protested against the Inquisition and said, "Did our victorious ancestors ever once attempt to extirpate Christianity out of Spain when it was in their power? Did they not suffer your forefathers to enjoy the free use of their rights at the same time as they wore their chains? If there may have been some examples of forced conversions, they are so rare as scarce to deserve mentioning, and only attempted by men who had not the fear of God and the Prophet before their eyes, and who in doing so have acted directly and diametrically contrary to the holy precepts and ordinances of Islam, which cannot, without sacrilege, be violated by any who would be held worthy of the honorable epithet of Musalman. You can never produce among us any bloodthirsty formal tribunal on account of different persuasions in points of faith, that any wise approaches your execrable inquisition. Our arms, it is true, are ever open to receive all who are disposed to embrace our religion. But we are not allowed by our sacred Quran to tyrannize over consciences. So religious toleration and freedom of conscience, which were such marked features of old Indian life, slipped away from us to some extent, while Europe caught up to us and then went ahead in establishing, after many a struggle, these very principles. Today, sometimes there is communal conflict in India, and Hindus and Muslims fight each other and kill each other. It is true that this happens only occasionally in some places, and that mostly we live in peace and friendship, for our real interests are one. It is a shameful thing for any Hindu or Muslim to fight his brother in the name of religion. We must put an end to it, and we will, of course, do so. But what is important is to get out of that complex ideology of custom, convention, and superstition, which, under the guise of religion, enchains us. As in the case of religious toleration, India started off fairly well in regard to political freedom. You will remember our village republics, and how originally the king's powers were supposed to be limited. There was no such thing as the divine right of the kings of Europe. Because our whole polity was based on village freedom, people were careless as to who was the king. If their local freedom was preserved to them, what did it matter to them who was the boss above? But this was a dangerous and foolish idea. Gradually, the boss on top increased his powers and encroached on the freedom of the village. And a time arrived when we had absolutely autocratic monarchs, and there was no village self-government and no shadow of freedom anywhere from the top to the bottom. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 72, The Passing of the Middle Ages, July 1st, 1932. Let us look at Europe again from the 13th to the 15th centuries. There seems to be a tremendous amount of disorder and violence and conflict. The conditions in India were pretty bad also, but almost one would think that India was peaceful compared to Europe. The Mongols had brought gunpowder to Europe, and firearms were being used now. The kings took advantage of this to crush their rebellious feudal nobles. In this work, they got the help of the new merchant classes in the cities. The nobles were in the habit of carrying on little private wars of their own amongst themselves. This weakened them, but it harassed the countryside also. As the king grew in power, he put down this private warfare. In some places, there were civil wars between two rival claimants for the crown. Thus, in England, there was a conflict between two families, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Each party adopted a rose for its emblem. One, a white rose, the other, a red one. These wars are therefore called the Wars of the Roses. Large numbers of feudal nobles were killed in these civil wars. The Crusades also killed off many of them. Thus, gradually, the feudal lords were brought under control. But this did not mean that power was transferred from the nobles to the people. It was the king who grew more powerful. The people remained much the same, except that they were slightly better off by the lessening of private warfare. The king, however, developed more and more into an all-powerful and autocratic monarch. The conflict between the king and the new merchant classes was still to come. More terrible than war and massacre even, there came the Great Plague to Europe about 1348. It spread all over Europe from Russia and Asia Minor to England. It went to Egypt, Northern Africa, Central Asia, and then spread westward. It was called the Black Death, and it killed off people by the million. About a third of the population of England died, and in China and elsewhere, the death roll was stupendous. It is surprising that it did not come to India. This awful calamity reduced the population greatly, and often there were not enough people to till the land. Owing to the lack of men, the wages of workers tended to rise from their miserable level. But the landlords and property owners controlled the parliaments, and they passed laws to force people to work at the old miserable wage and not to ask for more. Crushed and exploited beyond endurance, the peasants and the poor revolted. All over Western Europe, these peasant revolts took place one after the other. In France, there was what is called Unjackery in 1358. In England, there was Wat Tyler's Rebellion, in which Tyler was killed in front of the English king in 1381. These revolts were put down, often with much cruelty. But new ideas of equality were slowly spreading. People were asking themselves why they should be poor and starve when others were rich and had an abundance of everything. Why should some be lords and others serfs? Why should some have fine clothes and others not even rags enough to cover themselves? The old idea of submission to authority, on which the whole feudal system was based, was breaking down. So the peasants rose again and again. But they were weak and disorganized, and were put down only to rise again sometime later. England and France were almost continually at war with each other. From early in the 14th century to the middle of the 15th century, there was what is called the 100 Years' War between them. To the east of France, there was Burgundy. This was a powerful state, nominally vassal to the King of France. But Burgundy was a turbulent and troublesome vassal, and the English intrigued with it, as well as with other powers, against France. France was for a while hemmed in on all sides. A good part of western France was for long in English possession. And the King of England began to call himself King of France also. When France was at the lowest ebb of her fortunes, and there seemed no hope for her, hope and victory came in the form of a young peasant girl. You know something of Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. She is a heroine of yours. She gave confidence to her dispirited people and inspired them to great endeavor. And under her lead, they drove out English from their country. But for all this, the reward she got was a trial and sentence of the Inquisition and the stake. The English got hold of her, and they made the church condemn her. And then, in the marketplace of Rouen, they burnt her in 1430. Many years later, the Roman Church sought to undo what had been done by reversing the decision condemning her. And long afterwards, they made her a saint. Jeanne spoke of France and of saving her patrie from the foreigner. This was a new way of speaking. At that time, people were too full of feudal ideas to think of nationalism. So the way Jeanne spoke surprised them, and they hardly understood her. We can see the faint beginnings of nationalism in France from the time of Jeanne d'Arc. Having got the English out of his country, the French king turned to Burgundy, which had given so much trouble. This powerful vassal was finally brought under control, and Burgundy became part of France about 1483. The French king now becomes a powerful monarch. He had crushed or brought under control all his feudal nobles. With the absorption of Burgundy into France, France and Germany came face to face. Their frontiers touched each other. But while France was a strong, centralized monarchy, Germany was weak and split up into many states. England was also trying to conquer Scotland. This too was a long struggle, and Scotland was often on the side of France against England. In 1314, the Scots under Robert Bruce defeated the English at Bannockburn. Even earlier than this, in the 12th century, the English began their attempts to conquer Ireland. 700 years ago that was, and since then there has been frequent war and revolt, and terror and frightfulness in Ireland. This little country refused to submit to an alien domination, and generation after generation has risen in revolt to proclaim that it will not submit. In the 13th century, another small nation of Europe, Switzerland, asserted its right to freedom. It formed part of the Holy Roman Empire, and Austria ruled it. You must have read the story of William Tell and his son, but probably this is not true. But even more wonderful is the revolt of the Swiss peasants against the great empire and their refusal to submit to it. 3 of the cantons revolted first and formed an everlasting league, as they called it, in 1291. Other cantons joined them, and in 1499, Switzerland became a free republic. It was a federation of the different cantons, and it was called the Swiss Confederation. Do you remember the bonfires we saw on many a mountaintop in Switzerland on the 1st of August? That was the National Day of the Swiss, the anniversary of the beginning of their revolution, when the bonfire was the signal to rise against the Austrian ruler. In the east of Europe, what was happening to Constantinople? You will remember that the Latin Crusaders captured this city from the Greeks in 1204 AC. In 1261, these people were driven out by the Greeks, who re-established the Eastern Empire again. But another and a greater danger was coming. When the Mongols had advanced across Asia, 50,000 Ottoman Turks had fled before them. These were different from the Seljuk Turks. They looked up to an ancestor or founder of a dynasty named Othman or Osman. Hence, they were called Ottoman or Osmanli Turks. These Ottomans took refuge under the Seljuks in Western Asia. As the Seljuk Turks weakened, the Ottomans seemed to have grown in power. They went on spreading. Instead of attacking Constantinople, as many others had done before them, they passed it by and crossed over to Europe in 1353. They spread rapidly and occupied Bulgaria and Serbia, and made Adrianople their capital. Thus, the Ottoman Empire spread on either side of Constantinople in Asia and Europe. It surrounded Constantinople, but this city remained outside it. But the proud Eastern Roman Empire of 1,000 years was reduced to just this city and practically nothing more. Although the Turk was rapidly swallowing up the Eastern Empire, there appear to have been friendly relations between the sultans and the emperors, and they married into each other's families. Ultimately, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Turks. We shall now refer to the Ottoman Turks only. The Seljuks have dropped out of the picture. The fall of Constantinople, though long expected, was a great event which shook Europe. It meant the final end of the 1,000-year-old Greek Eastern Empire. It meant another Muslim invasion of Europe. The Turks went on spreading, and sometimes it almost seemed that they would conquer Europe. But they were checked at the gates of Vienna. The great cathedral of St. Sophia, which had been built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, was turned into a mosque. Hagia Sophia, it was called. And there was some plundering of its treasures. Europe was excited about this, but it could do nothing. As a matter of fact, however, the Turkish sultans were very tolerant of the Orthodox Greek Church. And after the capture of Constantinople, Sultan Muhammad II actually proclaimed himself the protector of the Greek Church. A later sultan, who is known as Suleiman the Magnificent, considered himself the representative of the Eastern emperors and took the title of Caesar. Such is the power of ancient tradition. The Ottoman Turks do not seem to have been very unwelcome to the Greeks of Constantinople. They saw that the old empire was collapsing. They preferred the Turks to the Pope and the Western Christians. Their experience of the Latin Crusaders had been bad. It is said that during the last siege of Constantinople in 1453, a Byzantine nobleman said, "Better the turban of the prophet than the tiara of the Pope." The Turks built up a peculiar corps called the Janissaries. They took little Christian children as a kind of tribute from the Christians and gave them special training. It was cruel to separate young boys from their parents, but these boys had some advantages also, as they were well-trained and became a kind of military aristocracy. This corps of Janissaries became a pillar of the Ottoman sultans. The word Janissary comes from Jan, life, Nisar, sacrifice, one who sacrifices his life. In a similar way, in Egypt, a corps of Mamelukes, corresponding to the Janissaries, was formed. This became all-powerful and even supplied the sultans to Egypt. The Ottoman sultans, by taking Constantinople, seem to have inherited many of the evil habits of luxury and corruption from their predecessors, the Byzantine emperors. The whole degraded imperial system of the Byzantines enveloped them and gradually sapped their strength. But for some time they were strong, and Christian Europe was in fear of them. They conquered Egypt and took the title of Caliph from the weak and powerless representative of the Abbasides who then possessed it. From that time onwards, the Ottoman sultans called themselves the Caliphs, till some years ago, when Mustafa Kemal Pasha put an end to it by abolishing both the Sultanate and the Caliphate. The date of the fall of Constantinople is a great date in history. It is supposed to be the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Middle Ages are over. The 1,000 years of the Dark Ages end, and there is a quickening in Europe, and fresh life and energy are visible. This is called the beginning of the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning and art. People seem to wake up, as from a long sleep, and they look back across the centuries to ancient Greece in the days of her glory and draw inspiration from her. There is almost a revolt of the mind against the somber and dismal view of life encouraged by the Church and the chains that encompass the human spirit. The old Grecian love of beauty appears, and Europe blossoms out with fine works of painting and sculpture and architecture. All this, of course, was not caused suddenly by the fall of Constantinople. It would be absurd to think so. The capture of the city by the Turks did just a little to speed up the change, as it resulted in large numbers of learned men and scholars leaving it and going west. They brought with them to Italy the treasures of Greek literature just when the West was in a mood to appreciate them. In this sense, the fall of the city helped slightly in launching the Renaissance. But this was only a petty reason for the great change. The old Greek literature and thought was not a new thing in Italy or the West of the Middle Ages. In the universities, people studied it still, and learned men knew of it. But it was confined to a few, and because it did not fit in with the prevailing view of life, it did not spread. Slowly, the ground was prepared for a new view of life by the beginnings of doubt in the minds of the people. They were dissatisfied with things as they were and searched for something which might satisfy them more. While they were in this state of doubt and expectancy, their minds discovered the old pagan philosophy of Greece, and they drank deep of her literature. This seemed to them just the thing they sought, and the discovery filled them with enthusiasm. The Renaissance first began in Italy. Later, it appeared in France, England, and elsewhere. It was not just a rediscovery of Greek thought and literature. It was something far bigger and greater. It was the outward manifestation of the process that had been going on under the surface in Europe for a long time. This ferment was to break out in many ways. The Renaissance was one of them. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 73. The Discovery of the Sea Routes. July 3rd, 1932. We have now reached the stage in Europe when the medieval world begins to break up and give place to a new order. There is discontent and dissatisfaction against existing conditions, and this feeling is the parent of change and progress. All the classes that were exploited by the feudal system and the religious system were discontented. We have seen that peasant revolts, or jacqueries, as they are called in French, from Jacques, a peasant name, were taking place. But the peasants were still very backward and weak, and in spite of their revolts, could gain little. Their day was yet to come. The real conflict was between the old feudal class and the new, wide-awake middle class, which was growing in power. The feudal system meant that wealth was based on land, was in fact land. But now a new kind of wealth was being accumulated, which was not from land. This was from manufactures and trade. And the new middle class, or bourgeoisie, profited by this, and this gave them power. This conflict was already an old one. What we now see is a change in the relative positions of the two parties. The feudal system, though still continuing, is on the defensive. The bourgeoisie, confident of its new strength, takes up the offensive. The struggle goes on through hundreds of years, ever more and more in favor of the bourgeoisie. It varies in different countries of Europe. In Eastern Europe, there is little of the struggle. It is in the West that the bourgeoisie first comes into prominence. The breaking down of the old barriers meant an advance in many directions: in science, in art, in literature, in architecture, in new discoveries. That is always so when the human spirit breaks its bonds. It expands and spreads out. Even so, when freedom comes to our country, will our people and our genius expand and spread out in all directions? As the hold of the church relaxes and grows weaker, people spend less money on cathedrals and churches. Beautiful buildings grow up in many places, but they are town halls and the like. The Gothic style also retires, and a new one develops. Just about this time, when Western Europe was full of a new energy, came the lure of gold from the East. Stories of Marco Polo and other travelers who had been to India and China excited the imagination of Europe. And this stimulus of untold wealth in the East drew many to the sea. Just then came the fall of Constantinople. The Turks controlled the land and the sea routes to the east, and they did not encourage trade much. The big merchants and traders chafed at this. The new class of adventurers who wanted to get at the gold of the East were also annoyed. So they tried to find out new ways of reaching the golden East. Every schoolgirl knows now that our earth is round and that it goes round the sun. This is such an obvious thing to all of us. But it was not very obvious in the old days. And those people who ventured to think so and say so got into trouble with the church. But in spite of the fear of the church, more and more persons began to think that the earth was round. If it was round, then it should be possible to reach China and India by going west. So some thought. Others thought of reaching India by going round Africa. You must remember that there was no Suez Canal then, and ships could not go from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Goods and merchandise used to be sent overland, probably on the backs of camels, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, and were transferred to fresh ships on the other side. This was not convenient at any time. With Egypt and Syria under the Turks, this route became even more difficult. But the lure of India's wealth continued to excite and draw people. Spain and Portugal took the lead in the voyages of exploration. Spain was just then driving out the last of the Moors, or Saracens, from Granada. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united Christian Spain, and in 1492, nearly 50 years after the Turks took Constantinople on the other side of Europe, Granada of the Arabs fell. Spain immediately became a great Christian power in Europe. The Portuguese tried to go east, the Spaniards west. The first great advance was the discovery by the Portuguese in 1445 of Cape Verde. This cape is the westernmost point of Africa. Look at the map of Africa. You will see that as one sails down from Europe towards this cape, one has to go southwest. At Cape Verde, one goes round the corner and begins going southeast. The discovery of this cape was a very hopeful sign, for it made people believe that they would be able to go round Africa towards India. It took another 40 years, however, before Africa was rounded. In 1486, Bartholomew Diaz, also a Portuguese, went round the southern tip of Africa, that is, what is called the Cape of Good Hope. Within a few years, yet another Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, took advantage of this discovery and came to India via the Cape of Good Hope. Vasco da Gama reached Calicut on the Malabar coast in 1498. So the Portuguese won in the race to reach India. But meanwhile, great things were happening on the other side of the world, and Spain was to profit by them. Christopher Columbus had reached the American world in 1492. Columbus was a poor Genoese and, believing that the world was round, he wanted to go to Japan and India by sailing west. He did not think that the journey would be nearly as long as it turned out to be. He went about from court to court, trying to induce some prince to help him in his voyage of exploration. At last, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain agreed to do so, and Columbus started with 3 little ships and 88 men. It was a brave and adventurous voyage into the unknown, for no one knew what lay ahead. But Columbus had faith, and his faith was justified. After 69 days of sailing, they reached land. Columbus thought this was India. It was, as a matter of fact, one of the West Indies. Columbus never reached the American continent, and to the end of his days, he believed that he had reached Asia. This strange mistake of his has persisted to this day. These islands are still called the West Indies, and the original inhabitants of America are called Indians or Red Indians even now. Columbus came back to Europe and went again next year with many more ships. The discovery of the new route to India, as it was thought, excited Europe very much. It was soon after this that Vasco da Gama hastened his eastern voyage and reached Calicut. As the news of fresh discoveries came from east and west, the excitement in Europe grew. The two rivals for dominion over these new lands were Portugal and Spain. The Pope then appeared on the scene, and to prevent any conflict between Spaniards and Portuguese, he decided to be generous at other people's expense. In 1493, he issued a bull. The papal announcements or edicts are for some reason called bulls, called the Bull of Demarcation. He drew an imaginary line from north to south 100 leagues west of the Azores and declared that Portugal was to have all the non-Christian lands to the east of this line and Spain the lands to the west of the line. A magnificent gift it was of nearly the whole world, minus Europe, and it cost the Pope nothing to make it. The Azores are islands in the Atlantic Ocean, and a line drawn 100 leagues, that is, about 300 miles to the west of them, would leave the whole of North America and most of South America to the west. Thus, practically, the Pope made a present of the Americas to Spain, and of India, China, Japan, and other eastern countries, as well as the whole of Africa, to Portugal. The Portuguese set about taking possession of this vast dominion. This was not so easy. But they made some progress and continued to go east. They reached Goa in 1510, Malacca in the Malay Peninsula in 1511, Java soon after, and China in 1576. This does not mean that they took possession of these places. They just got some footings in a few places. Their future career in the East we shall have to discuss in a subsequent letter. Among the Portuguese in the East was a man called Ferdinand Magellan. But he fell out with his Portuguese masters and, returning to Europe, became a Spanish subject. Having been to India and the eastern islands by the eastern route, via the Cape of Good Hope, he now wanted to go there by the western route, via America. Probably he knew that the land discovered by Columbus was far from being Asia. Indeed, in 1513, a Spaniard named Balboa had crossed the mountains of Panama in Central America and had reached the Pacific Ocean. For some reason or other, he called this the South Sea, and standing on the shore of it, he claimed the new sea and all lands washed by it as possessions of his master, the King of Spain. In 1519, Magellan started on his western voyage, which was going to be the greatest voyage of them all. He had 5 ships and 270 men. He crossed the Atlantic to South America and continued going south till he reached the end of the continent. He had lost 1 ship by shipwreck and another had deserted. 3 ships remained. With these, he crossed the narrow strait between the South American continent and an island, and came out into the open sea on the other side. This was the Pacific Ocean, so called by Magellan because it was very peaceful compared to the Atlantic. It had taken him just 14 months to reach the Pacific. The strait he passed through is still known after him, the Strait of Magellan. Magellan then bravely continued north and then northwest across the unknown sea. This was the most terrible part of the voyage. No one knew that it would take so long. For nearly 4 months, 108 days to be exact, they were in mid-ocean with little to eat or drink. At last, after great privation, they reached the Philippine Islands. The people they met there were friendly to them and gave them food and exchanged gifts. But the Spaniards were offensive and overbearing. Magellan took part in some petty war between 2 chieftains and was killed. Many other Spaniards were killed by the people of the island because of their overbearing attitude. The Spaniards were looking for the Spice Islands, where the precious spices came from. They went on in search for them. Another ship had to be given up and burnt. Only 2 remained. It was decided that one of these should go back to Spain via the Pacific, and the other via the Cape of Good Hope. The former ship did not go far, as it was captured by the Portuguese. But the other one, named the Victoria, crept round Africa and reached Seville in Spain, with 18 men in 1522, just 3 years after it had sailed. It had gone round the world, and it was the first ship to do so. I have written at some length about the voyage of the Victoria because it was a wonderful voyage. We cross the seas now in every comfort and take long journeys in big ships. But think of these early voyagers who faced all manner of danger and peril, and plunging into the unknown, discovered the sea routes for those who came after them. The Spaniards and Portuguese of those days were proud and overbearing and cruel people. But they were wonderfully brave and full of the spirit of adventure. While Magellan was going round the world, Cortes was entering the city of Mexico and conquering the Aztec Empire for the Spanish king. I have already told you something of this and of the Maya civilization of America. Cortes reached Mexico in 1519. Pizarro reached the Inca Empire, where Peru is now, in South America in 1530. By courage and audacity, and treachery and cruelty, and taking advantage of internal dissensions of the people, Cortes and Pizarro succeeded in putting an end to 2 old empires. But both of these empires were out of date and in some ways very primitive. So they fell down like a house of cards at the first push. Where the great explorers and discoverers had gone, hordes of adventurers followed, eager for loot and plunder. Spanish America especially suffered from this crowd, and even Columbus was treated very badly by them. At the same time, gold and silver flowed unceasingly to Spain from Peru and Mexico. Enormous quantities of these precious metals came, dazzling Europe, and making Spain the dominating power of Europe. This gold and silver spread to other countries of Europe, and thus there was an abundant supply of money with which to buy the products of the East. The success of Portugal and Spain naturally fired the imaginations of the people of other countries, especially of France and England and Holland and the North German towns. They tried hard at first to find a passage to Asia and America by a northern route, north of Norway to the east, and via Greenland to the west. But they failed in this, and then took to the well-known routes. What a wonderful time this must have been, when the world seemed to be opening out and showing her treasures and marvels. New discoveries came one after another, oceans and new continents, and wealth beyond measure just waiting for the magic call, open sesame. The very air must have breathed of the magic of these adventures. The world is a narrower place now, and there is little to discover in it. So it seems. But that is not so, for science has opened up tremendous new vistas which wait to be explored. And of adventure there is no lack, especially in India today one. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 74, The Breakup of the Mongol Empires. July 9th, 1932. I have written to you of the passing of the Middle Ages and of the awakening of the new spirit in Europe and the new energy which found outlets in many ways. Europe seems to be bustling with activity and creative effort. Her people, after being cooped up in their little countries for centuries, burst out and cross the wide oceans and go to the uttermost corners of the world. They go forth as conquerors, confident in their own strength. And this very confidence gives them courage and makes them perform wonderful deeds. But you must have wondered how this sudden change took place. In the middle of the 13th century, the Mongols dominated Asia and Europe. Eastern Europe was in their possession. Western Europe trembled before these great and seemingly invincible warriors. What were the kings and emperors of Europe compared to even a general of the great Khan? 200 years later, the Ottoman Turks were in possession of the imperial city of Constantinople and a good bit of southeastern Europe. After 800 years of fighting between Muslim and Christian, the great prize, which had lured the Arabs and the Seljuks, had fallen into the hands of the Ottomans. Not content with this, the Ottoman sultans looked with hungry eyes to the west, even at Rome itself. They threatened the German Holy Roman Empire and Italy. They conquered Hungary and reached the walls of Vienna and the frontiers of Italy. In the east, they added Baghdad to their dominions. In the south, Egypt. In the middle of the 16th century, Sultan Suleiman, called the Magnificent, ruled over this great Turkish empire. Even on the seas, his fleets were supreme. How then did this change occur? How did Europe get rid of the Mongol menace? How did it survive the Turkish danger? And not only survive it, but become aggressive itself and a menace to others. The Mongols did not threaten Europe for long. They went away of their own accord to elect a new Khan, and they did not come back. Western Europe was too far away from their homelands in Mongolia. Perhaps also it did not attract them because it was woody country and they were used to the wide open plains and steppes. In any event, Western Europe saved itself from the Mongols not by any valor of its own, but by the indifference and the preoccupations of the Mongols. In Eastern Europe, they remained for some time longer, till the Mongol power gradually broke up. I have already told you that the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453 is supposed to be a turning point in European history. It marks, for the sake of convenience, the passing of the Middle Ages and the coming of the new spirit, the Renaissance, which flowered out in a variety of ways. Thus, curiously, just when Europe was threatened by the Turks, and the Turks seemed to have a good chance of success, Europe found her feet and developed strength. The Turks went on advancing in Western Europe for a while, and while they advanced, European explorers were discovering new countries and seas and rounding the globe. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, who reigned from 1520 to 1566, the Turkish Empire spread from Vienna to Baghdad and Cairo. But there was no advance after that. The Turks were succumbing to the old, weakening and corrupting traditions of the Constantinople of the Greeks. As Europe increased in power, the Turks lost their old energy and became weaker. In the course of our wanderings through past ages, we have seen many invasions of Europe by Asia. There were some invasions of Asia by Europe, but they were of little moment. Alexander went across Asia to India without any great result. The Romans never went beyond Mesopotamia. Europe, on the other hand, was repeatedly overrun by Asiatic tribes from the earliest times. Of these Asiatic invasions, the Ottoman invasion of Europe was the last. Gradually, we find the roles are reversed, and Europe takes up the aggressive. This change might be said to occur about the middle of the 16th century. America, newly discovered, goes down quickly before Europe. Asia is a more difficult problem. For 200 years, Europeans try to find footholds in various parts of the Asiatic continent, and by the middle of the 18th century, they begin to dominate parts of Asia. It is well to remember this, as some people, ignorant of history, imagine that Europe has always bossed it over Asia. This new role of Europe is quite a recent one, as we shall see, and already the scene is changing and the role appears out of date. New ideas are astir in all the countries of the East, and powerful movements aiming at freedom are challenging and shaking the domination of Europe. Wider and deeper even than these nationalistic ideas are the new social ideas of equality, which want to put an end to all imperialism and exploitation. There should be no question in future of Europe dominating Asia or Asia dominating Europe, or any country exploiting another. This has been a long preface. We come back to the Mongols. Let us follow their fortunes for a while and see what happened to them. You will remember that Kublai Khan was the last great Khan. After his death in 1292, the vast empire, which stretched right across Asia from Korea to Poland and Hungary in Europe, split up into 5 empires. Each of these 5 empires was in reality a very big empire. In a previous letter, number 68, I have given you the names of these 5. The principal one was the Empire of China, including Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, Korea, Annam, Tonkin, and part of Burma. The Yuan dynasty, descendants of Kublai, succeeded to this, but not for long. Very soon, bits of it dropped off in the south, and as I have told you, in 1368, just 76 years after Kublai's death, his dynasty fell and the Mongols were driven away. In the far west was the Empire of the Golden Horde. What a fascinating name these people had. The Russian nobles paid tribute to it for nearly 200 years after Kublai's death. At the end of this period, 1480, the empire was weakening a little, and the Grand Duke of Moscow, who had managed to become the chief Russian noble, refused to pay tribute. This Grand Duke is called Ivan the Great. In the north of Russia, there was the old Republic of Novgorod, which was controlled by merchants and traders. Ivan defeated this republic and added it to his dukedom. Constantinople, meanwhile, had fallen to the Turks, and the family of the old emperors had been driven out. Ivan married a girl of this old imperial family, and thus claimed to be in the imperial line and an heir to old Byzantium. The Russian Empire, which was finally ended by the revolutions of 1917, began in this way, under Ivan the Great. His grandson, who was very cruel and was therefore called Ivan the Terrible, gave himself the title of Tsar, which was the equivalent of Caesar or Emperor. Thus the Mongols finally retired from Europe. We need not trouble ourselves much about the remains of the Golden Horde or the other Mongol empires of Central Asia. Besides, I do not know much about them. But one man claims our attention. This man was Timur, who wanted to be a second Genghis Khan. He claimed to be descended from Genghis, but he was really a Turk. He was lame and is therefore called Timur-i-Lang, or Timur the Lame, or Tamurlane. He succeeded his father and became ruler of Samarkand in 1369. Soon afterwards, he started on his career of conquest and cruelty. He was a great general, but he was a complete savage. The Mongols of Central Asia had meanwhile become Muslims, and Timur himself was a Muslim. But the fact that he was dealing with Muslims did not soften him in the least. Wherever he went, he spread desolation and pestilence and utter misery. His chief pleasure was the erection of enormous pyramids of skulls. From Delhi in the east to Asia Minor in the west, he caused to be massacred hundreds of thousands of persons and had their skulls arranged in the form of pyramids. Genghis Khan and his Mongols were cruel and destructive, but they were like others of their time. But Timur was much worse. He stands apart for wanton and fiendish cruelty. In one place, it is said, he erected a tower of 2,000 live men and covered them up with brick and mortar. The wealth of India attracted this savage. He had some difficulty in inducing his generals and nobles to agree to his proposal to invade India. There was a great council in Samarkand, and the nobles objected to going to India because of the great heat there. Ultimately, Timur promised that he would not stay in India. He would just plunder and destroy and return. He kept his word. Northern India was then, you will remember, under Muslim rule. There was a sultan at Delhi. But this Muslim state was weak, and constant warfare with the Mongols on the frontiers had broken its backbone. So, when Timur came with an army of Mongols, there was no great resistance, and he went on gaily with his massacres and pyramids. Both Hindus and Muslims were slain. No distinction seems to have been made. The prisoners becoming a burden, he ordered all of them to be killed, and 100,000 were massacred. At one place, it is said, both the Hindus and Muslims jointly performed the Rajput ceremony of Jauhar, marching out to die in battle. But why should I go on repeating this story of horror? It was the same all along his route. Famine and disease followed Timur's army. For 15 days, he remained in Delhi and converted that great city into a shambles. He returned to Samarkand after plundering Kashmir on the way. Savage as he was, Timur wanted to put up fine buildings in Samarkand and elsewhere in Central Asia. So he collected, as Sultan Mahmud had done long before him, artisans and skilled mechanics and master builders in India, and took them with him. The best of these master builders and craftsmen he kept in his own imperial service. The others were spread in the chief cities of Western Asia. thus developed a new style of architecture. After Timur's departure, Delhi was a city of the dead. Famine and pestilence reigned unchecked. There was no ruler or organization or order for 2 months. There were few inhabitants. Even the man Timur had appointed as his viceroy in Delhi retired to Multan. Timur then went west, spreading desolation across Persia and Mesopotamia. At Angora, he met a great army of the Ottoman Turks in 1402. By brilliant generalship, he defeated these Turks. But the sea was too much for him, and he could not cross the Bosphorus. So Europe escaped him. 3 years later, in 1405, Timur died as he was marching towards China. With him collapsed his great empire, which covered nearly the whole of Western Asia. The Ottomans paid tribute to him. So did Egypt. So did the Golden Horde. But his ability was confined to his generalship, which was remarkable. Some of his campaigns in the snows of Siberia were extraordinary. But at heart, he was a barbarous nomad, and he built up no organization and left behind him no competent men, as Cengiz had done, to carry on the empire. So the empire of Timur ended with him and left a memory only of massacre and desolation. In Central Asia, of the hordes of adventurers and conquerors who have passed through it, 4 men are remembered still: Sikandar or Alexander, Sultan Mahmud, Cengiz Khan, and Timur. Timur shook up the Ottoman Turks by his defeat of them. But they recovered soon and, as we know, in another 50 years, 1453, they took Constantinople. We must take leave of Central Asia now. It goes back in the scale of civilization and sinks into obscurity. Nothing of note happens which will demand our attention. Only the memory of old civilizations remains, destroyed by the hand of man. Nature also laid a heavy hand on it, and gradually made the climate drier and less habitable. We must also bid goodbye to the Mongols, except for a branch of them which subsequently came to India and built a great and famous empire here. But the empire of Cengiz Khan and his descendants breaks up, and the Mongols revert to their petty chieftains and their tribal habits. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 75. India begins to tackle a difficult problem. July 12, 1932. I have written to you of Timur and his massacres and pyramids of heads. How horrible and barbarous all this seems. Such a thing could not happen in our civilized age. And yet, do not be so sure. We have only recently seen and heard of what can and does happen even in our own times. The destruction of life and property caused by Cengiz Khan or Timur, great as it was, pales almost into insignificance before the destruction during the Great War of 1914 to 18. And every Mongol cruelty can be rivaled by modern instances of frightfulness. Yet it is undoubted that we have progressed in 100 ways since the days of Cengiz or Timur. Life is not only vastly more complicated, but it is richer. And many of the forces of nature have been explored and understood and brought to the use of man. Certainly the world is more civilized and cultured now. Why then do we relapse back into barbarism during periods of war? Because war itself is a negation and denial of civilization and culture, except insofar as it takes advantage of the civilized brain to invent and use more and more powerful and horrible weapons. With the coming of war, most people who are involved in it work themselves up into a terrible state of excitement, forget much that civilization has taught them, forget truth and the graces of life, and begin to resemble their savage ancestors of a few thousand years ago. Is it then surprising that war, whenever waged, is a horrible thing? What would a stranger to this world of ours say if he were to visit us during wartime? Suppose he only saw us then, and not during peacetime. He would only judge by the war, and come to the conclusion that we were cruel and relentless, savages occasionally showing courage and sacrifice, but, on the whole, with few redeeming features, and with one master passion to kill and destroy each other. He would misjudge us and form a distorted view of our world, because he would see only one side of us at a particular and not very favorable time. So also, if we think of the past in terms of wars and massacres only, we shall misjudge it. Unfortunately, wars and massacres have a way of attracting a great deal of attention. The day-to-day life of a people is rather dull. What is the historian to say about it? So the historian swoops down on a war or battle and makes the most of it. Of course, we cannot forget or ignore such wars, but we must not attach more importance to them than they deserve. Let us think of the past in terms of the present, and of the people in those days in terms of ourselves. We shall then get a more human view of them, and we shall realize that what really counted were the day-to-day life and the thoughts of those people, and not the occasional wars. It is well to remember this, as you will find your history books overfull of such wars. Even these letters of mine are apt to stray in that direction. The real reason for this is the difficulty in writing about the day-to-day life of past times. I do not know enough about it. Timur, as we have seen, was one of the worst afflictions that befell India. One shudders to think of the trail of horror which he left behind him wherever he went. And yet, southern India was wholly unaffected by him. So also the east and west and central India. Even the present United Provinces practically escaped him, except for a bit in the north near Delhi and Meerut. The Punjab, besides Delhi city, was the province that suffered most by Timur's raid. Even in the Punjab, the main sufferers lay along the route taken by Timur. The vast majority of the people of the Punjab carried on their ordinary work without any interruption. So we must be on our guard not to exaggerate the importance of these wars and raids. Let us look at the India of the 14th and 15th centuries. The Delhi Sultanate shrinks till it vanishes away on Timur's coming. There are a number of large independent states all over India, mostly Muslim. But there is one powerful Hindu state, Vijayanagar, in the south. Islam is no longer a stranger or a newcomer in India. It is well established. The fierceness and cruelty of the early Afghan invaders and the slave kings have been toned down, and the Muslim kings are as much Indians as the Hindus. They have no outside connections. Wars take place between different states, but they are political and not religious. Sometimes a Muslim state employs Hindu troops and a Hindu state Muslim troops. Muslim kings often marry Hindu women, and Hindus are often employed as ministers and high officials by the Muslim kings. There is little of the feeling of conqueror and conquered or ruler and ruled. Indeed, most of the Muslims, including some of the rulers, are Indians converted to Islam. Many of these become converted in the hope of gaining court favor or economic advantage, and in spite of their change of religion, they stick to most of their old customs. Some Muslim rulers adopt forcible methods to bring about conversion. But even this is largely with a political object, as it is thought that the converts would be more loyal subjects. But force does not go far in bringing about conversions. A more effective method is the economic. Non-Muslims are made to pay a poll tax called the jizya, and many of them, wishing to escape this, become Muslims. But all this takes place in the cities. The villages are little affected, and the millions of villagers carry on in the old way. It is true that the king's officers interfere more in village life. The powers of the village panchayats are less now than they used to be. But still the panchayats continue and are the center and backbone of village life. Socially, and in the matter of religion and custom, the village is almost unchanged. India, as you know, is still a country of hundreds of thousands of villages. The towns and cities sit on the surface, as it were. But the real India has been, and still is, village India. This village India was not much changed by Islam. Hinduism was shaken up in two ways by the coming of Islam, and, strange to say, these ways were contrary to each other. On the one side, it became conservative. It hardened and retired into a shell in an attempt at protecting itself against the attack on it. Caste became stiffer and more exclusive. The parda and seclusion of women became commoner. On the other hand, there was a kind of internal revolt against caste and too much puja and ceremonial. Many efforts were made to reform it. Of course, right through history, from the earliest times, reformers have risen in Hinduism who have tried to rid it of its abuses. Buddha was the greatest of these. I have also told you of Shankaracharya, who lived in the 8th century. 300 years later, in the 11th century, there lived in the south, in the Chola Empire, another great reformer who was the leader of a rival school of thought to that of Shankara. His name was Ramanuja. Shankara was a Shaivite and a man of intellect. Ramanuja was a Vaishnavite and a man of faith. Ramanuja's influence spread all over India. I have told you how, right through history, India has been culturally united, even though politically it may have been split up into many warring states. Whenever a great man or a great movement arose, it spread all over India regardless of political boundaries. After Islam had settled down in India, a new type of reformer rose among the Hindus, as well as among the Muslims. He tried to bring the two religions nearer to each other by laying stress on the common features of both and attacking their rites and ceremonials. An effort was thus made to bring about a synthesis of the two, that is to say, a kind of mixture of the two. It was a difficult task, as there was much ill feeling and prejudice on both sides. But we shall see that century after century, this effort was made. Even some of the Muslim rulers, and notably the great Akbar, tried to bring about this synthesis. Ramanand, who lived in the south in the 14th century, was the first well-known teacher who preached this synthesis. He preached against caste and ignored it. Among his disciples was a Muslim weaver named Kabir, who became even more famous later on. Kabir became very popular. His songs in Hindi, as you perhaps know, are very well known now even in remote villages in the north. He was neither Hindu nor Muslim. He was both, or something between the two, and his followers came from both religions and all castes. There is a story that when he died, his body was covered with a sheet. His Hindu disciples wanted to take it for cremation. his Muslim disciples wanted to bury it. So they argued and quarreled. But when they lifted up the sheet, they found that the body for the possession of which they were quarreling had disappeared. And in its place, there were some fresh flowers. The story may be quite imaginary, but it is a pretty one. A little after Kabir, there rose another great reformer and religious leader in the north. This was Guru Nanak, who was the founder of Sikhism. He was followed, one after the other, by the 10 Gurus of the Sikhs, the last of whom was Guru Gobind Singh. One other name, famous in Indian religious and cultural history, I should like to mention here. This was Chaitanya, a famous scholar of Bengal early in the 16th century, who suddenly decided that his scholarship was not worthwhile and left it and took to the ways of faith. He became a great bhakta who went about singing bhajans with his disciples all over Bengal. He founded also a Vaishnavite order, and his influence is still great in Bengal. So much for religious reform and synthesis. In all other departments of life also, there was this synthesis going on, sometimes consciously, more often unconsciously. A new culture, a new architecture, a new language was growing up. But remember that all this took place far more in the cities than in the villages, and especially in Delhi, the imperial capital, and the other great capitals of states and provinces. At the top, the king was more autocratic than ever before. The old Indian rulers had custom and convention to check their autocracy. The new Muslim rulers did not have even this. Although, in theory, there is far more equality in Islam. And, as we have seen, even a slave could become sultan, still the autocratic and unchecked power of the king increased. What more amazing instance of this can one have than that of the mad Tughlaq, who moved the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad? The practice of keeping slaves, especially by the sultans, also increased. A special effort was made to capture these in war. Artisans were specially valued amongst them. The others were enrolled in the Sultan's guard. What of the great universities of Nalanda and Takshashila, or Takshila? They had long ceased to exist, but many new university centers of a new type had arisen. Tolls, they were called, where the old Sanskrit learning was imparted. They were not up to date. They lived in the past and probably kept up a spirit of reaction. Benares has all along been one of the biggest of such centers. I have spoken above of Kabir's songs in Hindi. Hindi was thus in the 15th century already not only a popular but a literary language. Sanskrit had long ceased to be a living language. Even in the days of Kalidas and the Gupta kings, Sanskrit was confined to the learned. The ordinary people talked a Prakrit, a variation of Sanskrit. Slowly, the other daughters of Sanskrit developed: Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and Gujarati. Many Muslim writers and poets wrote in Hindi. A Muslim king of Jaunpur in the 15th century had the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad translated from the Sanskrit into Bengali. The accounts of the Muslim rulers of Bijapur in the south were kept in Marathi. So we find that already in the 15th century, these daughter languages of Sanskrit had grown up considerably. In the south, of course, the Dravidian languages, Tamil and Telugu, and Malayalam and Kannadas, which means Kannada, were much older. The Muslim court language was Persian. Most educated people learnt Persian if they had anything to do with the courts or government offices. Thus, large numbers of Hindus learnt Persian. Gradually, a new language developed in the camps and bazaars called Urdu, which means camp. In reality, this was not a new language. It was Hindi with a slightly different dress on. There were more of Persian words in it, but otherwise it was Hindi. This Hindi-Urdu language, or as it is sometimes called, Hindustani, spread all over northern and central India. It is today spoken with minor variations by about 150 million people and understood by a far greater number. Thus, it is, from the point of numbers, one of the major languages of the world. In architecture, new styles were developed and many noble buildings arose in Bijapur and Vijayanagar in the south. In Golconda, in Ahmedabad, which was then a great and beautiful city, and in Jaunpur, not far from Allahabad. Do you remember our visit to the old ruins of Golconda near Hyderabad? We went up the great fortress and saw, spread out beneath us, the old city, with its palaces and markets, ill in ruins now. So, while kings quarreled and destroyed each other, silent forces in India worked ceaselessly for a synthesis, in order that the people of India might live harmoniously together and devote their energies jointly to progress and betterment. In the course of centuries, they achieved considerable success. But before their work was completed, there was another upset, and we went back part of the way we had come. Again, we have today to march the same way and work for a synthesis of all that is good. But this time, it must be on surer foundations. It must be based on freedom and social equality, and it must fit in with a better world order. Only then will it endure. The problem of this synthesis of religion and culture engrossed the better mind of India for many hundreds of years. It was so full of it that political and social freedom were forgotten. And just when Europe shot ahead in a dozen different directions, India remained behind, unprogressing and vegetating. There was a time, as I have already told you, when India controlled foreign markets because of her progress in chemistry, in the making of dyes, in tempering steel, and for many other reasons. Her ships carried her merchandise to distant places. India had long lost this control at the time of which we are speaking. In the 16th century, the river began to flow back to the east. It was a small trickle to begin with, but it was to grow till it became a mighty stream. Dear friends and students, you were listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Please subscribe to the channel and help us grow. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.